when we leave the EU, Atalanta is due under CSDP rules to lose Northwood as its operational headquarters, I understand. How significant to the mission of Atalanta do you think is the British provision of headquarters in comparison to the contribution, say, of Spain, other EU members like Spain and Italy, whom you mentioned?
I think it's quite a difficult question to answer in terms of comparators, because I don't have a comparison, and I think it would probably be wrong to do so against another nation, because nobody else is doing this in the same way. So if I may, I'll answer two parts to it. I think the contribution is key that we nationally as the framework nation have given to Atalanta. And I think that comes to the innovation of the Mercury system, for example, working with the shipping industry to best management practice. And I think the location with the shipping industry in the early times and constantly, 70% of world shipping is insured by Lloyd's, which is in London. So there's definitely that connection. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that a UK framework offers is both military and diplomatic relationships. So some of that legal finish negotiation was done through Kenya, was done through Seychelles, which was done through our UK political auspices to then enable an EU activity. And some of the other relationships, such as in Bahrain, the deputy commander of CMF is a British officer, and we put quite a lot of emphasis into the Coalition Maritime Force. So just by the very nature of that UK to UK relationship, you can then build that out to the relationship between EU and another organisation. So I think there are a number of strands that we have offered with innovation and military and diplomatic relationships which have been key throughout. But then I'd also highlight the contributions of other particular nations in terms of force generation and force flow. And I'm probably going to get this wrong in terms of offending somebody in open record, but the Italians are significant contributors, the Spanish are significant contributors, the Dutch are, the Swedes put people on Dutch ships, the Germans contribute an MPA, and so there is a significant group of people within the EU who are very definitely significant contributors to the Atalanta game. And my deputy, for example, is a very excellent Spanish admiral. Who looks to the tactics while I look up and out. So I think to try and compare it would be wrong, because a lot of nations are very bought into this process and ensure that the sum of parts are absolutely where they should be. Thank you.
Yes. Good morning, General. I wonder if you could say something about the UK's security objectives in the Horn of Africa. How does Operation Atalanta contribute to achieving our security objectives, and how does it complement the UK's bilateral initiatives?
I think the first point, my Lord, is to see Atalanta as part of a broader maritime security architecture, which is something that Admiral Aquilino and I, who commands the American three-sided commands the CMF, are very definitely trying to make sure we take forward, because it's not independent actors doing their own thing. There is a synergy between all activity, ideally in the Gulf of Aden and in the Somali Basin. So the linkage to our national security objectives, I think, of the activity that we deliver is quite profound. And there are actually, we've sort of done some thinking, and there are 4 of the 5 within the National Maritime Strategy, which was published in 2014, which I believe we contribute to. The first is promoting a secure international maritime domain and upholding international maritime laws and norms. We're absolutely in that space in terms of our operations and our activity. The second is developing maritime governance and capacity within the member states within that particular area. It is a secondary task for me, but one of the things that we do with the ships that we have at sea is local maritime capacity building. And although it's not one of my key objectives in terms of vulnerable shipping and piracy, one of the things that we see is that we actually absolutely have to try and help elements of the Somalian capability to be able to do their own business at sea. So absolutely we are contributing to that UK national security objective as we go along. The third one is protecting UK citizens, our economy, and supporting the safety and security of ports, offshore installations and Red Ensign Group vessels and cargo ships. which goes to the very heart of my mission. So, and the port security is also interesting because EU CAP, which is the capacity building activity, another sort of sister EU activity, are focusing on the 4 main ports of Somalia in their capacity building efforts in terms of Mogadishu, Bosaso, Berbera, and Kismayo. And the final one, Your Lordship, I think where we contribute is assuring the security of vital maritime trade and energy transportation routes within the UK marine area, both regionally and internationally. And without a doubt, part of our very raison d'etre is the free flow of trade. And it's absolutely where we are. So I genuinely do believe that Atalanta contributes quite significantly to those 4 national security objectives.
Very nice, Madam.
Good morning. You've comprehensively outlined the 4 strands of Operation Atalanta and indeed your role in it already to Lord Stirrup. I just wondered whether those objectives could be achieved outside the EU and what, in your view, would be the advantages and disadvantages. And of course, I'm thinking of Brexit as opposed to the objectives and advantages that you've already outlined.
Barry, it's a far-reaching question, so I will do my best to dance through it. There is already, so in order of how to meet counter-piracy objectives, I think the first point I'd make is one of the organisations that I've already mentioned, the Coalition Maritime Force, sorry, the Combined Maritime Force, has one of its task groups, which is Task Group 151, has a specific counter-piracy mandate. And we work alongside it. And so there is no doubt that if the UK wished to contribute, whether in staff, whether in planning or in assets, one could contribute into 151 to contribute to the counter-piracy efforts that are ongoing in the Somali Basin and that area of the Indian Ocean. You could also, from a UK perspective, essentially deploy your assets and then put them in associated support of other missions, which is what some people do to Atalanta. And what associated support means is essentially it's on national tasking, it's a national asset, but it's saying while it is in that area, it is happy to exchange information and, if necessary, react with that organisation if an incident was to occur. Associated support is quite a vexed issue because, in reality, from my perspective as an operational commander, it isn't a replacement for core coherent activity. It adds a little bit of value, but fundamentally those ships go where the individual nation wishes them to go rather than as a core asset to your operation. I think the interesting part of it is, so that's the answer of where we could contribute elsewhere to the objectives we achieve. I think the areas where I would say Atalanta has a discrete and advantage over probably CMF is probably threefold. The first one I've already talked about is the legal finish. It isn't the same with where the Combined Maritime Force is, and so that is more difficult from a legal perspective if you were to support 151. The second one is the scale and geography. Clearly, people contribute to 151 based on their own national interest, and most people's national interest is in the Gulf of Aden, that international shipping corridor through the Bab el-Mandeb and up. Less so in the Somali Basin. At Atalanta, it has a slightly more geographical focus on the Somali Basin, which is a huge piece of sea. So there's a synergy between 151 and 150 from CMF and our activity that we seek to coordinate where our assets are to give the optimum spread. And so Atalanta has a spread in a different place to that which the CMF does. And the final one, which I would say where Atalanta has an advantage, is we are the only operation that is allowed to operate in Somali internal waters. And that is an agreement with the Somali government that we can work within inside the 12-mile limit. We can work what I would phrase in brown water rather than the open sea. And that allows me to actually do capacity building, to do engagements on the land with coastal communities. And that's something that other missions don't have. So I think you can absolutely do counter-piracy in other ways, and there are other mechanisms to do so, but I do think that Atalanta has probably those three advantages which are slightly different.
Thank you.
That agreement to operate within territorial waters. That's a political agreement between Somalia and the EU?
Yes, Lord Stewart, it is, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose the question one would have to reflect on, I'm not asking you for an answer, is whether it was the political size and clout of the EU that enabled that agreement to be reached more easily than it might have been done through sort of a bilateral agreement between nations, as it were.
I think I'll offer a view, if that's
Yeah,
all right.
please do.
I think, Lord Stewart, that is again one of the mechanisms that the EU has in that it can speak with one voice for those 28 nations with EU-DEL in Somalia, so the EU delegation in Somalia into the government. So I think its ability to a certain degree to talk from a military and civilian political perspective is a benefit, whereas the combined military force is very definitely a military alliance as opposed to a political alliance. And I think that probably is one of the reasons the mechanism has unfolded in such a way.
How many of the vessels going through the area are European Union vessels as opposed to non-European?
I can't really give you great fact and figure, but it's probably better if I could answer the question from a relationship perspective. It's probably the best way to do it, Your Lordship, if you're happy. So there are three structures in which I can employ people as the commander of Atalanta. There's either an EU nation, Spain or Italy or Germany, contributing resource to, physical resource to the operation, and I task them appropriately within the operational design. There then are third-party states that have asked to play a part, and some.
No, I meant which the nature of the vessels going through.
The merchant vessels.
The merchant vessels. Sorry, I got that.
Sorry, forgive me.
Yeah.
It's such a broad question, I mean, but fundamentally, I can't really answer it. But you know, if you consider the quantity of trade that runs through,
it's huge.
It's huge. It's enormous.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to get at is essentially the European Union is operating on behalf of the whole world in this area. I mean, there is massive traffic,
yes,
commercial traffic going through this area, most of which is probably not European Union connected.
Yes, so I think the other part of this is we talked about your first question about connection of EU activity within Somalia. I think Atalanta plays a part in the broader EU regional view in terms of what's going on in the Middle East, what's happening in Africa and what's happening in the Indian Ocean. We are part of essentially an EU footprint looking at the safety into Europe of free trade and the flow of commerce. So I think we do have a broader role that isn't just about Somalia, it's about, and I think the EU would see it as such.